Catholics in the Crescent City, the First 300 Years, is presented by the Gail and Tom Benson Charitable Foundation and the Willwoods Community. Additional underwriting support provided by the Archdiocese of New Orleans and First Bank and Trust.
For 300 years, New Orleans has watched over this part of the Mississippi River. And for that same 300 years, the Catholic Church has watched over New Orleans.
You really can't separate the history of the city and the presence of the Catholic Church. They are totally intertwined throughout the 300 years.
At first, ruled by church and crown, along the way New Orleans developed its own identity and government and culture. But the Catholic roots have always been there, running deep, even today.
We say everybody's not Catholic here. The city is Catholic. The city's roots are Catholic. I look at people that have been here for generations, and whether their family is Catholic now or not, somewhere along the line, if you go far enough back and their families were here, they were Catholic.
In 1850, New Orleans was becoming a metropolis. Its population of 116,000 made it the fifth largest city in the United States. A port city overflowing with hopes and dreams, and sometimes struggles and troubles. To keep pace with the growing needs of a growing city, Archbishop Anton Blanc put out a call for help, and brothers and sisters from Europe were answering.
So during this time, religious women and men, particularly women religious who have contributed so much to Catholic education and to social services, have seen this as a ministry. They've done all of this not just as social workers, though social workers are very important and valuable people, but they have done it in the name of Christ.
For some, their commitment, their heroism, would cost them their lives.
Yellow fever on occasion wiped out wide percentages of the church and of the faithful, as well as just the citizens of New Orleans. It's really remarkable how many people suffered from yellow fever and how many people we lost. We also had outbreaks of cholera and sometimes typhoid.
In 1853 alone, of the 154,000 people in the city, 8,000 died. A new cemetery, St. Patrick's No. 1, was born in the wake of so much death.
They were burying so rapidly with hundreds of people dying that they were just putting bodies all over. So St. Patrick No. 1, if you go in there to visit, it's not in straight rows. It's just graves on top of graves. And we're not clear whether that was because they were meant to go back and move them later to permanent graves, or they just didn't have the staff available at that time to be able to handle all of that, and that's why the cemetery is organized the way it is now.
In 1855, the first English-language Catholic newspaper rolled off the presses.
Obviously, the English-speaking population in New Orleans was growing, and so English Catholics decided to form their own paper. It was called the Catholic Standard, and really only lasted from about 1855 to 1862.
While there were more and more English-speaking residents of New Orleans, many people still spoke French or their native language. Bishop Blanc saw what was coming, though, sending some priests north a bit to learn English. Many of them learned more than language.
There's a great letter of a priest that gets sent to live with an Irish family, and he's a French priest, and he's trying to learn English, and he keeps writing back to the Archbishop, to Bishop Lawn, saying, I'm really trying. Here's my first letter in English. And eventually he says, this couple that I'm staying with, they're so wonderful, but they put all of the food on the plate together. They don't serve it in courses, and it just turns my stomach. And it really is comical because it isn't the French way of serving it in courses for him. So he's getting it all piled on his plate, and he's being told to eat.
One solution to the language differences resulted in 3 churches, built right next to each other in what is now the Irish Channel and Lower Garden District. St. Alphonsus for the Irish, St. Mary's Assumption for the Germans, and Notre Dame de Bon Secours for the French. All 3 were staffed by the Redemptorists, many of whom were multilingual. During Archbishop Blanc's leadership, more than 20 churches opened their doors to serve the growing city. By 1860, nearly 170,000 people called New Orleans home. The following year, Louisiana seceded from the United States and joined the Confederacy. In April 1862, the Civil War marched into New Orleans. Union troops quickly took over. It was a city under siege and under martial law. The unpopular Union General Benjamin Beast Butler angered people in the city and well beyond when he issued General Order 28. Tired of being disrespected by the women of the city, who had been known to spit at or curse at, or occasionally dump chamber pots on unsuspecting soldiers, Butler's orders said that any woman who so much as turned their back on or refused to answer a question would be treated as a prostitute. The soldiers in the city were okay with it, but it sparked outrage elsewhere, in the South, the North, and even overseas. Although the city was spared the widespread burning and sacking seen in other southern cities, life had changed. Supplies were scarce. All trade was embargoed, even food. An Irish widow named Margaret Howery would have none of that. The no-nonsense Catholic businesswoman who had been so helpful and generous with the Daughters of Charity needed to get flour across the lines to make bread for the orphans and the needy. She went directly to the unpopular Union General Butler and presented her case. Her determination got her a pass, and she was again able to help feed the children. She gave her time and her income selflessly, supporting, among many other charities, 4 orphanages. When she died, there wasn't enough room in St. Patrick's Church to fit all of the mourners. A city-wide collection was taken, and the people put up a statue in her honor, in front of an orphanage she had helped build. It was inscribed simply, Margaret. The monument still stands where Camp and Poydras Streets meet. The war years were hard years. Embargoes crushed the economy. Occupation and hardships embittered the people. And the suffering did not end with the war. Federal military officials governed for another 12 years. And the ever-present threat of disease kept claiming lives. A German priest, Father Francis Xavier Silos, arrived in New Orleans in 1866 to serve and help.
Yellow fever really hit hard the German population and the Irish population because they were the workers. They were the ones that were digging the canals. And, Blessed Silos comes here, Father Silos comes here when the Redemptorists would only send a priest if he volunteered to come into Louisiana because the yellow fever was so prevalent. And he actually contracts the disease and dies while he's ministering to people that are that sick.
Blessed Francis Xavier Silos was buried in St. Mary's Assumption, one of the 3 Redemptorist churches he was serving. He was declared blessed by Pope John Paul II in April of 2000. Another German priest, Father Peter Leonard Thevis, the pastor at Holy Trinity Church, was also trying to protect his flock. He made a vow that if his parishioners would be spared from yellow fever, he would build a chapel. He kept his promise and built the St. Roch Chapel in 1876, right in the cemetery. Over the years, people who attributed their healing to St. Roch have left a unique collection of votive offerings inside a small room in the chapel. Artificial limbs hang from the walls. Strange mementos and artifacts dangle and stare, and bricks of thanks line the floor. The Morning Star began its run 3 years after the end of the Civil War. At the time, it was the only English-language Catholic paper in the South.
And for the time, it was the longest-running Catholic newspaper in New Orleans history. It was really in the Reconstruction era, so obviously a lot of information about what was going on in civil society in New Orleans was in there. It was a very well-regarded newspaper and lasted a very, very long time.
The Morning Star would be published through 62 years of tranquil and turbulent times. Reconstruction in New Orleans was a roller coaster of politics and violence and change. What seemed like opportunities were trampled. At the time, most of the country's black Catholics lived in South Louisiana. The Catholic Church faced the challenge of incorporating them into the mainstream of the church and its schools. In many New Orleans Catholic churches, blacks and whites already worshiped together, although seated in separate sections. So much of the focus was on education and schools. The thriving Sisters of the Holy Family were already doing that. They'd already opened a couple of schools and a home for the elderly when they got a good deal on the Orleans Ballroom near the cathedral. The place once popular for those quadroon balls, where free women of color were matched up with wealthy white men. The sisters bought it, turning it into their convent and St. Mary's School.
Each religious community came with a different focus and a different charism. And from those religious communities, we have grown into parish schools and independent Catholic schools, and we are truly blessed to have this rich culture.
As the turn of the century was closing in, thousands of Italian immigrants, fleeing political turmoil in their own country, made their way to New Orleans. Many came to find familiar work in the area's sugarcane fields.
The Sicilians came to Louisiana in the late 1800s through early 20th century in droves. The largest group of Sicilians were recruited following the American Civil War because there were no workers for the cane fields.
Many settled in the French Quarter, but as with many other new faces, these immigrants were often viewed with distrust and suspicion. Mother Frances Xavier Cabrini in Italy decided she needed to come to New Orleans after hearing the horrifying news of a mass lynching of Italians. 11 immigrants were accused of murdering the Irish police chief. A mob attacked the prison where they were being held and murdered them all. Cabrini felt she had to come to support her people, and while she was in New Orleans, she opened a school and an orphanage. A legacy that lives on today. Canonized in 1946, she became the first naturalized U.S. citizen to be declared a saint. As the calendar changed to 1900, New Orleans had fallen from its rank as the 5th largest city in the U.S. to the 12th largest. Still, nearly 290,000 people called New Orleans home, and they were on the move. Infrastructure improvements allowed people to spread out from the city center. And finally, the last big wave of yellow fever would run its course in New Orleans. One of its last victims, Archbishop Placide Louis Chapelle. In the early 1900s, language would be a driving force for evangelization.
Immigrants came and they wanted to be Americans. They saw themselves now with a different identity, and so we had a common language that was English at the time, and maybe the first generations had a harder time learning the new language because when you're older, it's a little bit harder to pick up a language, but the young people would be out and they wanted to be integrated into the community.
They're losing the young people because they're not speaking English in church. They're teaching in French, or they're teaching in German, or some other minister in a Protestant church is grabbing them because they're on fire in English. So the kids want to go hear English sermons.
Sermons in English would be included at the cathedral as well as in many other churches.
So out of each church grew the ministry of Catholic education. So parishes formed schools to educate the children that were their parishioners, that were members of their church parish. And so we began this growth and this explosion of schools in the city of New Orleans to care for and educate and form spiritually those who were coming to church on Sundays.
Grammar and secondary schools helped form the hearts and minds of young Catholics. And for many, their education could continue without leaving the city. The Jesuits, who already had a long history of education in New Orleans, separated their secondary school, Jesuit High School, and the College of the Immaculate Conception. And in 1904, they opened Loyola College, which 8 years later would become Loyola University. Loyola would actually help the Marianites of Holy Cross create their own college. The sisters were able to take college courses at Loyola as they prepared to expand their Academy of Holy Angels school by adding a normal or teacher's college. That decision in 1916 began a journey that would lead to Our Lady of Holy Cross College, now the University of Holy Cross. Sister Catherine Drexel, an American heiress turned nun, brought her Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament to New Orleans in 1915. Her dreams of providing Catholic education for young black men and women in the city began with a high school, then a 2-year teacher's college, then a 4-year college that would become Xavier University. On the building dedication day, Catherine Drexel was nowhere to be seen. She was watching the grand ceremony from an upper window, unnoticed. She believed all praise belonged to God. Drexel and the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament would establish schools and missions in many states serving Native and African Americans. St. Catherine Drexel was canonized in 2000. A series of local and world events would change the city beginning in 1915. In late September that year, a hurricane tore through New Orleans. Flooding and structural damage left devastation throughout the city. The cathedral was heavily damaged, but for a few months remained open until it became obvious that it was not safe.
And at that point in time, by 1916, Easter was the last Mass that was said in the cathedral, and then it was considered condemned by the city until renovations took place. And it took several years before the cathedral was put back into the state that you really see it now.
In 1917, the U.S. declared war on Germany, entering what would become World War I. The city joined the country, sending men to defend and women to nurse the wounded. And the year after that, as the war came to an end, New Orleans became a battleground of a different sort. The flu pandemic hit the city hard. Hospitals, makeshift wardrooms, and homes were filled with the sick, the dying, and the dead. There were more than 54,000 cases of flu here. Nearly 3,500 died. Schools, churches, public buildings were ordered shut down. No large gatherings, sporting events and ceremonies, even funerals had to be small and private. Just as in previous years and contagions, the Catholic Church was there to help. The sick found remedy in hospitals staffed by the religious. Orphans found comfort in the care of sisters. By the early 1920s, that help would have the official name, the Board of Catholic Charities.
The various congregations came, and our works have been education, health care, and social services. All of those works, every religious congregation, each of us had our own spin and our own spirit, but essentially the works were the same. The corporal works of mercy, taking care of the poor, the homeless, feed the hungry, visit the imprisoned. All of those works, those were the works of charity. Those were the direct commands of Jesus, and that's what we do to this day.
In 1923, the Notre Dame Seminary opened in New Orleans, finally a permanent seminary, where Louisiana and the Archdiocese could train and support its own priesthood. There were 25 seminarians in that first class.
And now Notre Dame is the second largest seminary in the United States, but it doesn't just serve the Archdiocese of New Orleans. You have priests from a number of different dioceses. It's become more of a regional seminary.
By 1932, a new Catholic newspaper appeared, Catholic Action of the South. For $1 a year, the weekly paper would be delivered by mail. The city would get its first airport on the lakefront in 1934, the Shushan Airport, named after the Levee Board president. 5 years later, it was renamed the New Orleans Airport, and eventually the New Orleans Lakefront Airport. In October of 1938, a huge gathering of Catholic leaders and lay people filled the city. The 8th National Eucharistic Congress was held in New Orleans, a 4-day event that saw more than 100,000 people, including 40,000 students, crowding City Park Stadium for a public mass. A special monstrance was created in commemoration, studded with precious gems donated by the people of the Archdiocese.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Then in 1941, the United States was again pulled into war. All Americans were called upon to help. Archbishop Joseph Rummel urged all Catholics to support the war effort, from service to work ethic to fundraising drives. And when it was over, the country and New Orleans saw a new burst of energy in the peace that followed. The GI Bill helped grow the educational and economic opportunities. In 1945, there were 385,000 Catholics in the Archdiocese, and that number would double in 20 years. More than $100 million was spent in the Archdiocese on new schools and other building projects. But, like most other places, public and private, they were all segregated, schools and churches.
And I think the church in Louisiana, especially in the Archdiocese of New Orleans, really looked at that seriously and took it seriously, especially because we had to deal with some of the horrors of it. I mean, Jim Crow laws existed even in the churches, where blacks had to, if they went into a non-black church, you sat in the back 2 pews or the choir loft and went to communion after white folks. There were, a lot of that happened in Louisiana, in this diocese. But what also happened in this diocese was some of the change.
Archbishop Rummel was the leader of the church here in New Orleans during desegregation. In 1948, he integrated the seminary, Notre Dame Seminary, allowing 2 African American men to come to study to become priests. In 1951, he allowed the Josephite priest to open St. Augustine High School to serve young African American men, to educate them. And then in 53, Archbishop Rummel ordered that all Catholic churches be desegregated. Then he tackled the issue of schools.
He said, what I have to do is I have to begin changing people's hearts, and I can't do that by decree. I have to begin slowly, slowly preparing people for the point when we can end segregation.
He was serious about that, in the face of some serious opposition.
In the 50s, when an African priest went down to Plaquemine Parish, I believe it was, and was refused, he closed the parish for 3 years, from 55 to 58.
Archbishop Rummel's plan was too fast for some, too slow for others. He got some help when Archbishop John Cody came to town.
And certainly Archbishop Cody, who was his coadjutor, also was here to say, hey, no, this is something that we as a Catholic Church, especially a Catholic Church in the South, we have to promote racial equality. And almost in every issue of the Clarion Herald back in the early 60s, that was a big part of the agenda, to help people understand why this was important and why really racism is a sin.
Archbishop Cody announced the desegregation of all Catholic schools beginning in the 62-63 school year.
And of course, when the schools were actually desegregated, basically all hell broke loose. You know, and a lot of the people that he counted on abandoned him. And of course we had the protests and all the other things that went with it.
Archbishop Rummel, he was ahead of his time when he said our schools must be integrated. There must be black children and white children going to school together. And he was publicly ridiculed, and there was a lot of protest against him because of this. So much so that there were 3 people that, now we wouldn't do this today, but in those days, he said, if you're that much against the Catholic teaching, and if you're that much against who I am as the leader, then do not consider yourself as a member of the church. And those were very extreme situations.
There were troubles and slow acceptance, but enrollment in Catholic schools actually increased in the 3 years following desegregation, and many others took a stand and took action.
The auditorium at Ursuline Academy was built in the 1960s because as the school integrated, they were not allowed to have graduation in the municipal auditorium or in any of the other public spaces because they still had a segregation amongst people. So the Ursulines, with contributions from the families that were there and through other benefactors, built their own auditorium in order to have graduation. Still have it today in that auditorium.
One Friday in 1965, the doors at Jesuit High's gym were locked for a secret but barrier-breaking basketball scrimmage. Jesuit met St. Augustine's Purple Knights that day. Those school leaders wanted to prove it could be done without incident. No clock, no audience. And for months, no one even knew. 2 years later, St. Augustine met Holy Cross in the Catholic League's first year of interracial matchups.
The tension was tremendous. You could feel it. It was breaking barriers that were taboo and saying, no, this is the way it's going to be. And this is how it needs to be.
Tad Gormley Stadium was packed. And the one thing I think it did is like the game happened, the teams competed very hard, and after that, everyone went home. That was one of those moments where everybody said, you know what, maybe we're not so different after all, and that's a good thing.
The church was stepping up, and it was obviously had an influence in society because it was, I think, 50 years ago that the Rex Parade invited St. Aug band to march in the parade. So people like that, Rex planting seeds, Archbishop Rummel being very courageous in saying that all people must be respected beyond the color of their skin. We have to respect them as individuals, took a courageous stand.
For 3 years during this time, the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II, was establishing wide and sweeping changes in Catholic life, from Mass to music to ministry. As it neared its conclusion, a new archbishop was named for New Orleans, Archbishop Philip Hannon, the bishop who had delivered the eulogy for President John F. Kennedy. He rushed to the city, which had just been ravaged by Hurricane Betsy, and hit the ground running.
He had been appointed as the Archbishop of New Orleans, but had never been here. And he heard of the hurricane, and he left the Vatican Council and came to New Orleans to be among the people. And those are the pictures, the famous pictures of him in the white shrimp boots, standing practically in the water. And it's people like him who have made the presence of the church felt, the compassion of Christ felt in very, very difficult times.
Soon after Archbishop Hannon's arrival, Bishop Harold Parry came on board, the first African-American bishop in the 20th century U.S. Catholic Church.
When he was ordained, there were many people who said, that should not happen. He's a black man. That should not happen. And the church was also courageous. Archbishop Hannon was courageous in saying, we need him to be a bishop, and he's been called by God, and we will certainly go through with this.
Harold Parry, being the person he was the right person because he was one that was very identifiably black and very proudly Catholic. He endured a lot. There were churches that wouldn't welcome him, and yet it didn't deter him from being who he had to be, for the diocese as well as for the church.
It was an era of examples in and out of the church.
One thing that Archbishop Hannon did during integration, during the civil rights unrest, was when the public swimming pools would not allow African American children to swim in the pools, he opened the seminary pool and invited anyone that wanted to swim to be able to swim there.
Between New Orleans and Lafayette, the whole southern part of Louisiana, there are more black churches than anywhere else in the country. We played a major part in the whole black Catholic witness of the church in this country. 1/4 of the black Catholics in this country came from Louisiana. So just Louisiana itself. When the church started to develop black Catholic worship, New Orleans was primed for it and ready. In 1968, one of the earliest churches in the country to develop black worship, black Catholic worship, was St. Francis de Sales in New Orleans. And it became known throughout the country for that.
The 60s were times of change throughout society and the church and its ministries. Besides allowing new and different music in church, Vatican II turned around Mass. It would be in the language of the people, and the priest would turn and face the congregation, which posed a challenge to older churches like the cathedral.
But since the altar predated the Second Vatican Council, they had to be creative about how to make this work. So they literally cut the marble altar, pulled it out, and attached some legs to the back, and then added a shelf along the high altar to arrange the altar for the new Mass. So if you look carefully, the angel legs on the front of the altar are a different shade of marble than the legs that have been added on at the back.
Much about the look of Catholicism changed. Many religious exchanged their attire for a more modern style, and more lay involvement and social outreach was encouraged. Archbishop Hannon was instrumental in rallying the troops for social ministry transformation.
Because he had served in World War II, he had seen suffering, he was part of the liberation of the concentration camps, and he was this great reader, and he just very learned and started all the different projects within Catholic Charities, Second Harvest, St. Michael's School, Christopher Holmes. He got into TV. He was all about ministry. He was all about how do we forge ahead.
He forged, leading a lot of others with him. When he came to New Orleans, Catholic Charities had fewer than a dozen official institutions and programs. Within 22 years, that number had grown to 60 programs serving 45,000 people, from child care to elder care, feeding, housing, nursing, welcoming immigrants fleeing persecution.
There's a great spirit, and has always been a great spirit, of church groups working together. None of us believe that we can do everything by ourselves. So what we, Catholic Charities, might not be able to achieve, we have a partner relationship with somebody out there. And if we don't have it all, when the need comes, we establish it.
By 1989, the Archdiocese had become the largest provider of social services in the state. While addressing the social and spiritual needs of his new flock, Archbishop Hannon got a phone call in 1966, shortly after he took over in New Orleans. This issue, much easier to tackle.
Our Saints football team was born on November the 1st, and the Archbishop at the time, Archbishop Hannon, had received a phone call from the governor saying, we're going to start an NFL franchise. Can we call them the Saints? And Archbishop Hannon told them, sure, but you realize that a lot of saints were martyrs, and it may be a while before we win a game.
Saints. Why does that tie in perfectly with this town? It's just a natural. to me, it's one of the great names in sports because it fits perfectly with the whole Catholic thing. And that's when it was officially announced, All Saints Day. We were going to have an NFL franchise, and I thought it was incredibly apropos. Whoever was running the PR for that thing had it exactly right to do it on November 1st.
And in blessing the new franchise, Archbishop Hannon included some church history in with a prayer for strength by saying, "Our Heavenly Father, who has instructed us that the saints by faith conquered kingdoms and overcame lions, grant our saints an increase of faith and strength so that they will not only overcome the lions, but also the bears, the rams, the giants, and even those awesome people in Green Bay." He also asked that the fans would show a sense of charity to all, including the referees. Getting that Saints franchise lifted the spirits of the whole region, Catholic or not.
Okay, when I was an altar boy at St. Jerome Church, I had to do 10:30 Mass one Sunday, and the game kicked off at 1. And Father Ed Lawton was our pastor. And he looked at me, he says, "Is your father coming to pick you up? You guys are going to the Saints game?" I said, "Yes, we are." He said, "Don't worry about it. We won't be long today." And about 25 minutes later, Mass was over. I had tickets with my father, and Father Lawton had tickets. And you know what? I said, you know what? This guy, he might be the coolest priest I've ever met because he really understands how big this is.
Those first games were played at Tulane Stadium.
Let me tell you a group that made a lot of money on those Saints Sundays at Tulane Stadium, and those were the nuns at Ursuline Academy, because they were out there parking cars like crazy, and all their parking lots, and they were packed in there. And I don't know what they were charging, and whoever the principal was or the president of the school, but man, did they get a windfall from that, because Ursuline was literally 3 or 4 blocks from the stadium.
The Clarion Herald has been keeping area Catholics in the know since 1963, addressing issues of faith, religion, and life in the Archdiocese. It also helped put the brakes on a plan that would have changed the face of New Orleans.
In the mid-'60s, they were thinking about putting an interstate highway right on the riverfront, on the Mississippi riverfront. It was going to be the Riverfront Expressway, right near Café Du Monde. It would have certainly forever changed the landscape, certainly of New Orleans. And the Clarion, for about a year and a half, did all kind of drawings about how this elevated interstate would ruin, essentially, the iconic view of St. Louis Cathedral. The Clarion was important in getting that stopped.
Four decades later, nothing was stopping a disaster that did change the face of the city. Hurricane Katrina left behind tragedy and destruction. Lives lost, whole communities flooded, and survivors scattered. Schools, churches, homes ruined.
Disaster response is one of those services that we have become very good, unfortunately. And Katrina was the prime test of it.
At the Clarion, we published our first issue after Katrina, about 1 month after Katrina, October 1st. It was 8 pages. And basically the issue was, what's the status of where are our priests? Nobody knew where their priests were. Nobody knew what had happened to my church, what had happened to my school. So basically, it wasn't really stories. It was just kind of a list. Hey, this is what we know has happened to your church and your school, and here's where your priest is.
For many, the long road to recovery really began by keeping in touch with family, friends, and faith.
New Orleans is a city of hospitality, and that hospitality is based upon not only the culture of the people of New Orleans, it's built upon the faith life of the people of New Orleans. And the people of New Orleans are faith-filled people. Whether you're Catholic or not, we are faith-filled people. We believe that God calls us and encourages us to reflect His love and mercy in everything that we are about.
Much of the culture and many of the customs are hospitable. From the earliest days in the city, when the Ursuline nuns processed with the townspeople to their newly built convent, to the traditional 9-church walk that some still make on Good Friday, to the processions and parades that fill the streets before the beginning of Lent every year, New Orleanians like to celebrate, they like to be together, and they like to keep moving.
I always say that the people of New Orleans always look for a reason to have a party. They always look for a reason to have a parade. And so there is a lot, and I think it's important that we as Catholics in some way support and participate in those, because it is a way of lifting up our faith. If you look at most of the parades besides Mardi Gras, which is also in some ways a religious event, it's a preparation for Lent, but St. Joseph's Day, St. Patrick's Day, the Easter Parade, most of the parades are rooted somehow in the tradition of the church.
Sometimes they're even actually in the church. Bishop Cherie celebrated his ordination as auxiliary bishop with a homegrown New Orleans Catholic musical flair.
And I feel like doing my dance. And I feel like doing my dance. Oh, I've been through a lot at the press.
The only appropriate response to what this moment meant, not only for me, but I think really meant for my family, for the city of New Orleans.
I've been through a lot.
So it's part of our fabric. It's part of our celebrations. It's part of Mardi Gras. It's part of king cakes. It's part of, the Mardi Gras season begins on the Epiphany, which is January the 6th. So you have king cake. That little baby that's in there is a representation of baby Jesus, because it was the kings that were in search of baby Jesus. So you're in search of baby Jesus, which is in that cake.
You put food out there, people are going to come. And it's also even more evident on Mardi Gras, because the parades go right by in front of our church, and we serve food out of the cafeteria. We don't have a parish fair. We serve during Mardi Gras. That's the funding for our parish fair. And it's unbelievable the amount of food that goes through there. Most parishes have some sort of a fundraiser during the year. Most of them do a parish fair. We just serve food.
The St. Joseph's Altar tradition, celebrated on March 19th, is one carried here by Sicilian immigrants in the late 1800s.
It's a tradition that goes back many centuries to a time in Sicily when there was a great famine. The Sicilians prayed to St. Joseph, their protector, for relief from that famine, and were rewarded with a simple crop, the fava bean crop. So in Thanksgiving, they gave a feast in honor of St. Joseph.
Their faith and this family-centered observance kept them connected to home.
So this oral tradition was handed down through families from one generation to the next, with recipes, with methods, with specific ways of designing cakes that had religious symbolism that were always displayed on the St. Joseph's altars. So the tradition has always been to prepare beautiful foods, lots of vegetables, lots of seafood, no meat. Now, what's interesting is that prior to World War II, most of the St. Joseph's altars were in private homes.
Today, many St. Joseph altars are huge homemade works of art, and it's all given away.
We feed 3,000 people every year for free, and every year it gets bigger and bigger. I do one huge tray of pasta every year, and I bring it down there, and it's gone in literally like 10 minutes. And you think, they're feeding people for like 5 or 6 hours. Where is all this food coming from? It's the funnest day. It's really, really one of the funnest days in our parish.
November 1st, All Saints' Day, brings the faithful out to cemeteries throughout the area. It is a long-standing tradition for families and relatives to visit, clean, and decorate the graves of loved ones on that day. Over the years, cemeteries themselves have become a popular tourist attraction. 2 of the Catholic cemeteries are on the National Register of Historic Places. Few visitors come to New Orleans for fun without also stopping at one of these cities of the dead.
With St. Louis #1 being right on the outside of the French Quarter, we get a lot of the walking tours coming over. We average approximately 200,000 people going through St. Louis #1 a year, and it's only a 1 square block cemetery with narrow aisles.
While many of the tombs are captivating and beautiful, it is sometimes just the way they are filled that intrigues.
You will see some tombs away from here, but it's our reuse. We do reuse vaults, and that is very unique to our area, especially here in the South, because even other parts of Louisiana, you really don't see the reuse like we have, with families continuing to bury in the same family tomb over and over. We can go in and remove the casket, usually a minimum of a year later. Sometimes it may take longer than that, but that's how they reuse the family memorials.
There are 12 Catholic cemeteries in the city. All of them are still active cemeteries. And actually, beneath the St. Louis Cathedral itself, lie the bodies of many people, buried there from the earliest days of the city. Still today, there are spaces under the floors where archbishops and bishops can be laid to rest. The official name is the Cathedral Basilica of St. Louis, King of France, and it has always been both a place of worship and a place of wonder. Its prominence in this city of such strong Catholic roots attracts both parishioners and tourists to walk inside its doors. The city's Catholic heritage was on display in a different way when New Orleans hosted the World's Fair in 1984. One of the highlights was the Vatican Pavilion, filled with Catholic treasures and art. The Pope wasn't able to visit then, but 3 years later,
the TWA jet carrying the Holy Father and his party arrived in the late evening on Friday, September the 11th, 1987.
Pope John Paul II made a 3-day visit to New Orleans. Catholics and non-Catholics lined the streets to get a glimpse of the pontiff. Young people filled the Superdome, and the city gave him a small taste of Mardi Gras. He made an evening stop to greet the faithful at Xavier University, breaking away from his security to say hello to the crowd. And 130,000 people attended an outdoor mass on the lakefront campus of the University of New Orleans.
And of the Son, of the Holy Spirit, peace be with you.
The cathedral was standing room only, even outside, as the Pope-mobile made its way through the French Quarter.
It brought the papacy to the front door of St. Louis Cathedral. It made the Universal Church visibly present in our midst. Over 5,000 people were involved in the preparation and the actual visit. It was incredible. You know, the government, the city worked together, the police, everyone. They had the Mass at UNO. It was just an incredible thing. It's certainly a remarkable page in the history of the city and the Catholic history of the city.
Of course, it's even more exciting now that he's been named a saint. So it's, Saint Pope John Paul II. In fact, he lived in the residence where I live now, and the apartment where I live is where he stayed and ate at the dining room table and prayed in the chapel. So that is all sacred space to me. I always say that the house is a second-class relic because he was there. He made it his home for those days.
WLAE-TV, the public TV station set up by Archbishop Hannon and licensed under the Archdiocese, was there to capture the 36-hour visit. Lindy Boggs, the U.S. representative from Louisiana, was also there to greet the Pope, and 10 years later, she would go to Rome herself, appointed as the U.S. ambassador to the Vatican. When she died in 2013, her funeral was held where she had been a parishioner, at the St. Louis Cathedral. The church has been a part of many goodbyes and many more greetings, of somber remembrances and joyful celebrations. Many of these are kept in writing, preserved to protect the passage of time. The church's archives reach back to the beginning of the city.
It weaves together the history of the church and also families, and we believe that our archives are so sacred and so valuable because they tell the story, and we're glad when people want to come and use the archives to put together stories about the city, stories about our society, or stories about their family.
First French, then Spanish, and so many others. The languages of the people of New Orleans have changed and multiplied. Churches where language was a comfort from home helped evangelize and welcome those from a different place to help them make this their new home. Even today, the church reaches out to meet people where they are, their circumstances, their needs, their language.
We have 4 languages that, well, actually 5, that work within the Archdiocese that we minister to people. We still recognize French, we have Spanish, we have Vietnamese, we have sign language, and of course we have English.
Years ago, when the issue was more than a common language, when there just wasn't a church nearby, the church reached out with a traveling chapel rail car, even a chapel boat. Today, Catholic churches are, as some would say, around every corner, but there is still reaching out to do.
There's always more room for evangelization. There's always room to reach out. As Pope Francis reminds us, we can't wait for those people to come to the church. We have to go to them.
For 3 centuries, the church has walked alongside New Orleans and its people, helping to shape the future, strengthening hearts and communities, setting up cornerstones of faith throughout the Crescent City.
So the church is always changing, it's always evolving. It's always having to make sure that it keeps up with the times. So whether it's changing languages, whether it's ministering to people, it's always having to meet the needs of its people.
I really think that the people of the city of New Orleans through the years have been faith-filled, have been resilient, and certainly persevere. Even in the most difficult of times of warfare, of disaster, there was a sense of faith that came about. Because of that, the faith continues to be present and to grow in many, many ways.
We have grown a lot, and we still have a lot of growing to do. But the good news is that God has brought us safe thus far, and God will lead us on. And we just walk by faith. And you got to walk by faith, not by sight.
Walk, and sometimes dance, and parade. It's what we do here. It's what we strive to do. Keep the faith, keep God in the center of all things, and keep moving forward to face the next 300.
Catholics in the Crescent City, the First 300 Years is presented by the Gail and Tom Benson Charitable Foundation and the Willwoods Community. Additional underwriting support provided by the Archdiocese of New Orleans and First Bank and Trust.